Well, thanks everyone for coming out this afternoon, and I'm really, really glad that we actually have this talk because we very nearly didn't. Nayanjot Lahiri, our speaker, has literally has had a very un-Buddhist day of it. she went to the airport in the morning to find her flight was cancelled, and then bravely hopped on a bus and crawled through border snarls to be here. So thank you so much for really taking the effort. We missed you at a lunch we'd planned, and we regret not having more time with you. So, but I'm very, very glad that you're here. This talk, again, is part of our series of dialogues at Indian Summer, connecting not only Canada and India and South Asia, but simply being part of a global conversation on various levels, be it literature, politics, faith, history. And it's a great pleasure also. I thank you, Nayanjot, because through this talk, I have got to meet Victor Chan. Victor Chan is the co-founder of the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education in Vancouver. And when I reached out to him about your talk, he was instantly generous and said he would come and introduce you. So I think that's a great result of your visit here. And Victor has known the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, for almost 40 years now. And in 2005, they co-founded the center here. They've also written a book together, The Wisdom of Forgiveness, which he very kindly gifted me this afternoon, so thank you. The book, of course, it's been shortlisted for the best spiritual book of 2005 in the Nautilus Prize. It's been translated into 14 languages. And what's also really nice is that Victor is the person behind His Holiness's several visits to Vancouver, and he is arranging another one shortly. Victor's also written several other books on sacred sites in Tibet. And without further ado, I just want to say it's an honor to have you here, and please do come up, and leave it to you to introduce Nayanjot.
Well, Dr. Lahiri's talk today is very much after my own heart, because it touches on India, Buddhism, and of course, when she talks about Buddhism in India, Tibet and the Dalai Lama is not very far away. So, these are the kind of things that I have a lot of affinity with. And in particular, when I was doing research on my book on the sacred places of Tibet, one of the very important sources that I rely on are the Indian pundits of the 19th century who was sent by the Great Trigonometric Survey to go into Tibet and find out what it looks like. Because in the 19th century, nobody knows what Tibet looks like. So I was able to get a hold of some of the original expedition maps of the Indian pundits who explore Tibet and went into some of the most interesting pilgrimage routes. So there was this connection between India and Tibet and my own work as well. And in terms of Buddhism in India, I think back to when the Dalai Lama first went to Tibet, went to India. And that was 1956, when he was quite young. And that was a big celebration of Buddhism in India at that time. And at the same time, there was a guy in India called Ambedkar, who was one of the untouchables in India, one of the Dalits. And in 1956, just before he died, he converted into Buddhism. And at the same time, thousands and thousands of the Dalits were converted from Hinduism into Buddhism as well. And that is quite significant because the Dalai Lama have always quite sad by this caste system of India, and that he was something that someone who tried to change, to do away with the caste system in India. So, of course, Ambedkar's work was quite an inspiration for the Dalai Lama. And Dr. Lahiri's work is something very much fascinating to me. The exploration of the archaeological heritage, the trade routes in such a long ago past in India. And her work, one of her books was particularly fascinating for me, which is the Indus civilization along this Indus Valley. And I think the other thing that I am very interested in her work is that I think she has been quite associated with the rebirth of the Nalanda University, which was one of the oldest universities in the world, and it started, I think, in the 5th century, went on to the 12th, 13th century. It was the Oxford and Harvard of its day. And now they are spending, a number of countries are getting together, Singapore, India, China, Japan, to revive that amazing tradition of learning in Nalanda. And I think they're going to put about $1 billion to create this very international type of university. And Dr. Lahiri is, I think, involved in this effort. So I give you Dr. Lahiri.
It's really an honor to, be introduced by Victor Chan, and also I'm delighted to be here and, talking to you about Buddhism and about the Buddhist revival. I'm just wondering if we should dim the lights a little. Yeah. Now, the first thing which struck me when I started putting this together was that, since in the religious landscape of North America, there is, in a sense, a virtual explosion of Buddhism. You have books on Buddhism, in bookshops in vast quantities. You see Buddhist monks on television. You have meditation schools associated with universities. You have Buddhist temples in many places, including Vancouver. So, what is this Buddhist revival, you may well ask, that I'm talking about? Because, the religion is sort of doing very well in its current avatar. So let me begin by saying that I actually want to take you back to more than a century, or even further than that, to more early modern times than today, when Buddhism in its present form emerged, Buddhist modernity in a sense emerged. And that is a form which is frequently described as forming this phenomena of the Buddhist revival. It's a Pan-Asian phenomena. And, when we say Buddhist revival, at least the sense is not that Buddhism was dead in the 19th century, but that from the late 19th century onwards, it developed and it changed. And there was actually a massive expansion in the patronage that, Buddhism got, and in the religion's popularity. So it's really, a phenomena which, for me, evokes a variety of images. It reminds me of a number of people and of a number of places. And I thought that instead of immediately plunging into, the specific topic that I want to discuss this evening in my talk, it may be a good idea to actually just sketch out some of the elements which, I actually find very interesting, and I think they are important in understanding the revival of Buddhism in the context that I'm speaking about. To begin with, of course, one very important aspect was, as you're well aware of, the European discovery of Buddhism, where you have the study and translation of a variety of ancient texts. Combined with this are spectacular archaeological discoveries. And added to this is, of course, from the late 19th century onwards, a very systematic effort to conserve Buddhist sites in the Indian subcontinent and beyond as well. And what seems to me very clear is that these are frequently related to each other. For instance, these are names probably that you're familiar with. These are Chinese Buddhist pilgrims, Fa Hian and Xuanzang. These are just popular representations of them. They came in the first millennia AD and traveled very extensively in India. And their accounts were, made available to Europeans through a French translation in the middle of the 19th century. These French translations were read by the man who went on to become the first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. In India, a lot of the archaeology is done by a government body, which is the Archaeological Survey, and its origins actually go back to the 19th century. So Alexander Cunningham actually read these French translations and then decided, with those journals in hand, to go and discover many of the sites which we now consider to be iconic in the Buddhist religious landscape. It is Cunningham who discovered, this is Alexander Cunningham for you. And it's very interesting. I mean, if you just think of photographs, I'm just digressing a little. But, this guy was the explorer par excellence of the 19th century in India. And he just traveled thousands of kilometers in a time when it was actually fairly difficult to communicate. But when he decided to get an official photograph taken of himself, he's not appearing as an explorer, but as a collector, and of course surrounded by Buddhist reliquary caskets and Gandharan sculpture. Now, among the sites he, found was Taxila. He excavated Taxila. These are the ruins of Taxila as they appear today. It has very strong Buddhist associations, but he also went on to explore a variety of other sites. Kushinara, where the Buddha died. Mahabodhi, he has a full volume on Mahabodhi, where the Buddha attained enlightenment. Sarnath, where the first sermon was delivered by the Buddha. and so on and so forth. So the point I'm really trying to make is that the study of texts and the archaeological discoveries that take place on the ground are related. And of course, great discoveries relating to Buddhism continue to be made in the Indian subcontinent. Probably some of you are aware, but to just give you an instance, in Lumbini in Nepal, which is the birthplace of the Buddha, this is, an aerial view of Lumbini. And you have there, this is the Maya Devi temple, where his mother actually gave birth to him. And this was apparently, and of course this is all restored today, was the pond in which she actually bathed before that. And you also have an Ashokan pillar here. And, these are all the remains of, old monasteries and stupas and so on. Now, in this Maya Devi temple, this is from inside the temple, you had the remains of brick, a brick shrine, but many layers actually of brick shrines. And most importantly, there is a sandstone piece, which you see here, that is believed to pinpoint the exact location where the Buddha was born. And this stone slab was actually revealed after very meticulous excavations under 3 layers of ruins of the Maya Devi temple. And the excavation was done in 1993 to 96, jointly by the Department of Archaeology of Nepal and the Japan Buddhist Federation. So, it's not as if, the era of discoveries as far as Buddhism is concerned, that's over. Now, of course, this is something which interests me as an archaeologist. But when I visited Lumbini, I also realized that this is something which is actually very, very important for worshipping Buddhists as well. You can see here a group which had come from Sri Lanka, and each of the remnants, what I would call an archaeological ruin, and including, of course, this tree, they were sort of paying obeisance to it in, the manner that one would imagine happened, in the ancient context. And this is something which also I find, very fascinating, that what is unearthed by what, today we would think is of central interest to academia, that is, you have translations of literary texts, and you have discoveries by archaeologists, and you have historians talking about this. Actually, it doesn't remain confined at all to this world of scholars. And almost immediately, you find, that this spilled into the world of literature, it spilled into the world of art, and in, the world of religion, of course. Now, if you think of the English poet and journalist Edwin Arnold, his work, Light of Asia, is actually an example of this. It deals with the life and the teachings of the Buddha. It went through numerous editions and translations. In India, this young Brahmin boy who later became a Buddhist scholar sage called Dharmanand Kosambi, read it in Pune in a Marathi translation in the 19th century. And he says in his autobiography that the book became for him a kind of religious text. And he says, I have still not forgotten how, while reading certain portions of it, my throat would constrict and tears would stream down my face. So, this is not something which remains confined to academia and to the world of scholarship. It influences people in a very major way. He goes on to convert to Buddhism in a matter of a few years, and then he makes it the mission of his life to actually spread knowledge about the Buddha in Marathi, in Western India. The ramifications of this kind of work can also be seen in the world of art. One of the major painters of the nationalist school in India is Abanindranath Tagore. And, Abanindranath Tagore was one of those guys who actually painted a variety of historical subjects. And that, of course, included the Buddha. You can see here the Buddha as a mendicant on the one hand, and the second painting is of the Buddha with Sujata, the famous story of this village woman who actually came and fed, a starving Buddha, under the Bodhi tree. And if you can, if you look at that particular painting, you can see that it has a very strong Japanese element, to it. So this again, tells us something about the nature of Buddhist revival, that, when an Indian painter of the nationalist school is painting the Buddha, he is doing it in a style which is not quintessentially, an Indian style. Discoveries made in the field also became central in the agenda and the work of religious reformers. This, of course, is well known, but most famously, the movement to reclaim the Mahabodhi temple for the Buddhists. You can see the Mahabodhi temple in the foreground here. It marks the spot where the Buddha attained enlightenment, very close to it in any case. And this movement actually began very soon after its archaeological documentation and restoration in the latter part of the 19th century. Although originally this was a place which was associated with the Buddhists, over time it was a sacred space that also became important within the world of Hinduism. But in the form of the Buddhist revival that was associated with Mahabodhi in the late 19th century, especially the persona of Anagarika Dharmapala, who you see sitting here near the Mahabodhi temple. It's a very, very old photograph. His aim really was to restore Mahabodhi to its original form as an exclusively Buddhist place of worship. So again, there is research going on Mahabodhi, and that then becomes a starting point for a particular kind of, reification of Buddhist religious sites. So, all this, whether it's the French or it's, the Japanese element or the Sri Lankan element, as in the case of Anagarika Dharmapala and so on and so forth, the British, of course, by the 19th century, all of this had led to a sense that, like Christianity, Buddhism was actually a world religion. And it came to be recognized in the 19th century as a religion which actually extended to various parts of Asia and thus was transnational. And also in contrast to the old enemy, Islam, the British made it a point to make it out, which was of course correct, as an ethically high religion with universal significance. It's another matter that it should not have been juxtaposed with Islam, but it was juxtaposed with Islam, and on the other hand, it was juxtaposed with Hinduism, because unlike Hinduism with its caste-ridden practices, this was supposed to be, a religion which was much, much more egalitarian. And later, it is this egalitarian element, and which Victor Chan actually referred to, which adds an entirely new dimension to the Buddhist revival. It's seen as an alternative. This religion is seen as an alternative to caste-ridden Hinduism, above all by Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the first law minister of India, the founder of the Indian Constitution, as it were, but also the unquestioned leader of the Hindu untouchables, or Dalits as they are now called. when he converted to Buddhism, this is a photograph, at his conversion. He's here with his wife. She belonged to a very high Brahmin family, and she also actually converted, with him. An estimated 300,000 people converted at that point, and some months later, when he died, another 200,000 followers of his are known to have become Buddhists. So, although I'm, going to be soon speaking about a physical site of Buddhism, which is Sanchi, actually Buddhism itself was a site where, lives like Ambedkar and other lives intersected. For working out much larger social and religious reform in India. Now, to move on to the specific subject of my talk, actually this is neither about political leaders like Ambedkar, nor is it about religious reformers. It primarily concerns itself with Sanchi, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It's the locale of a very famous group of Buddhist monuments in central India, or Madhya Pradesh, as it's now called. You can see Bhopal here. It's actually very, very close to Bhopal. There are several very impressive monuments here, which are clustered around this very high Vindhyan hill outlier. The hill, of course, is dominated by what we call the Great Stupa or Stupa 1. And around this particular stupa, you have many memorial stupas, smaller ones, some which are much more significant than, just the votive ones. There are also monasteries, there are shrines, and so on and so forth. A stupa, for those who are not aware of this, it's a funerary mound, which is a typically Buddhist monument, but with a history older than Buddhism. And, Buddhist stupas generally contained the corporal relics of either the Buddha or his foremost disciples or other Buddhist teachers. There are also Buddhist stupas which mark spots associated with events relating to the life of the Buddha. Now, this particular stupa, you have a close view of it here, is the most striking element of the religious landscape of Sanchi. On the balustrade, on the pavements, on the wonderfully carved gateways, you have hundreds of inscriptions which encapsulate the long history of the Buddhist community here, a history which goes back to the 3rd century BC and continues till the 12th century after the beginning of the Christian era. So we are really looking at roughly 1,500 years of history at this particular site. But again, I'm not here concerned centrally with Sanchi's ancient history, but I just want to talk about its modern history. Now, I had mentioned that it falls in the state of Madhya Pradesh, but actually at that point in time, the history that I'm going to be talking about, it formed a part of the princely state of Bhopal. Now, generally, when we think of India in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, we think of British India. Now, as you can see from all the yellow on this map, there was a large part of India which existed outside British India. There were more than 500 princely states, for example. Some of these princely states were very large. Kashmir, for instance, the size of almost, a European state. But there were also others which were small, and Bhopal happened to be one such native state. Now, what is worth emphasizing is that Bhopal's rulers were neither Buddhist nor were they self-proclaimed saviors of Buddhism. But yet, this was a Muslim ruling house, and yet it was really very crucial in its revival and restoration. So this is the story that I want to tell. It's a little-known story, but I think it's worth retelling because It is the princely state of Bhopal's patronage which ensured that Sanchi became, and it continues to be actually, the modern icon of India's ancient Buddhist past. If on the one hand, we go back to Ambedkar's, conversion, on the dais when he was converted, there was actually a model of the Sanchi Stoop which was kept. And therefore, it's not surprising that at the spot, in the Diksha Bhumi, where he converted, there is actually a kind of replica which looks like Sanchi, marking that spot. Much before that, it was the same stupa which had provided inspiration for the dome of Viceregal House, now Rashtrapati Bhavan. This is where the President of India, resides. And interestingly enough, many decades later, in 2010, India's President, Pratibha Patil, actually dedicated a stoop costing several $1 million, inspired by Sanchi, to China. This is at the Buddhist monastic site of Luyong. So, Sanchi is not just any ancient Buddhist site, but it's actually very, very central to the way in which the Indian nation state thinks of itself vis-a-vis Buddhism and Buddhist heritage. So to actually look at the story of the restoration of Sanchi, I want to begin with Nawab Sultan Jahan Begum of Bhopal, who you see here with her eldest granddaughter, Abida Sultan. She was the last, that is Sultan Jahan Begum, she was the last in a dynasty of women rulers in Bhopal. Going back to 1819, Bhopal had actually had 3 women rulers before her. And, having 4 women rulers, that too in a Muslim princely state, is actually fairly unprecedented. And these were all amazing women. Sultan Jahan Begum's mother, for instance, Shah Jahan Begum, she built palaces and gardens and this fabulous masjid, which was called Tajul Masjid. And she felt that she actually had to live up to her name. She was named Shah Jahan after the Mughal emperor, who was a great builder, and she actually wanted to emulate him. As for Sultan Jahan, who you see here, Sultan Jahan is generally remembered for her work on education and on women's emancipation. But what is little known is her stellar role in Sanchi's restoration. Now, the story of Sultan Jahan's engagement with Sanchi begins in 1901. This was just after Viceroy Curzon had visited Sanchi. A viceroy in India at that point was, the equivalent of the Indian Prime Minister, because it's the highest executive authority. And Curzon was actually a very unusual viceroy in the fact that he was deeply devoted to the restoration and conservation of Indian monuments. Whatever may have been his other faults, this was something which really stands in striking contrast to all the viceroys who had ruled India before him and after him. And I think there is no Indian Prime Minister till date who can equal Curzon's record as far as restoration of monuments goes. So, I'm not surprised that he actually visited Sanchi in the first year of his viceroyalty in November 1899. And as at other monuments that he visited, and this again is very surprising, when you think of Viceroy, you think he has so many things to do. And what this guy used to do was, whichever monument he went to, he used to make a list of instructions about how the monument should be restored. He used to have sketches made. He used to check those sketches. He used to ensure that, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey, when he went there, was able to follow what, he wanted done there. So here also he left this list of instructions. And of course, Sanchi did need very large-scale repairs at that time. Sanchi was actually one of those monuments. When it was discovered in 1818, it was in a pretty good state of preservation. But as it came to be, explored and excavated by treasure hunters and by archaeologists, it fell into a state of complete disrepair because of the circumstances and the kind of work that used to be done in the 19th century. I mentioned to you Alexander Cunningham. He's again a name that is associated with Sanchi. Long before he became the Director General of the ASI, he had dug deep into the stupas at Sanchi to remove the relic caskets of the disciples of the Buddha. He found relic caskets as also, other kinds of, relics in them. But he never chose to actually repair what he had dug. So to give you a sense of what happened to the monuments, this is a picture of when one of the gateways was being repaired before Sultan Jahan's time, but you can see behind, the stupa has completely collapsed. So, of course, repairs had begun before the time of Sultan Jahan, but still large-scale restoration was actually necessary. Now, going back to Curzon's visit, as a follow-up, repairs were actually started there in 1904. They were started by the state engineer of Bhopal, a British state engineer called H.B. Cook. But his repairs, actually, his manner of execution proved to be alarmingly destructive. Usually, if you look at the work that is done on the conservation of old monuments, you try to actually conserve all the old, stones, even though they may be decayed, because actually the value and the authenticity of monuments depends upon the preservation of their ancient fabric. But Cook, instead of actually repairing structural elements, he decided to remove many of them. So several of the old railing pieces, coping stones and pillars from the main stupa's balustrade, which you see here, were taken out and they were replaced by him with new stones. This actually would give you a sense of what was removed. This is the original pillar. It's in situ, it's in one piece. And what Cook did instead was that wherever they were slightly broken, he removed them and then put new stones. And, there are three pieces instead of one. So you can see, Cook's so-called restoration even today at Sanchi. Now, what is amazing is that John Marshall, who was the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, was absolutely unaware that repairs of any kinds were going on at Sanchi. He, of course, visited Sanchi shortly afterwards, but as he put it, he said it was too late, actually, to undo Cook's restoration. But this, incident actually became the occasion for a larger dialogue within the portals of the colonial government about ways of conserving Sanchi. And interestingly, John Marshall explained away Cook's poor restoration as being something which was a result of Cook having suffered physical injuries. But he said that, look, Sanchi has a lot of sculpture lying around, and it seems to me that the caretakers of Sanchi have been very errant. And he then, made a very strong case for getting what he said were devoted hands to look after Sanchi. He felt that there should be Buddhist chowkidars and Buddhist caretakers there, instead of the Muslim caretakers who formed part of, the staff of the princely state of Bhopal. And he felt that such Buddhist caretakers could be arranged through the Mahabodhi Society. Now, in making this suggestion, I think John Marshall had not bargained for Sultan Jahan Begum. She would, of course, later become John Marshall's main benefactor at Sanchi. And if you look at his Sanchi volumes, they are dedicated to her memory. But their relationship did not actually begin on an optimistic note. Sultan Jahan was a very hands-on Begum. She used to inspect the treasury herself. She used to look at all the files. She used to appoint, state employees herself. So naturally, when Marshall's letter for replacing Muslim caretakers with Buddhist ones reached the Darbar, it was brought to her notice. And almost immediately, she conveyed both her distaste and her opposition to such a proposal. I think some of the opposition, it seems to me, stemmed from the fact that the Mahabodhi founder, Anagarika Dharmapala, had this troublemaker reputation. Dharmapala by then was a widely recognized figure in India. This is because of the agitation around the Mahabodhi temple. As I said, the fact that you had Hindu and Buddhist practices at the same spot was something that he found very unacceptable. And over time, a massive dispute developed around this. It was a dispute which led to a spate of litigation, and that litigation was widely reported in the Indian press. So the Begum must have known about this. And I think she must have also been aware of the parallels between her situation and that of the Hindu proprietor of Mahabodhi. Her religion, like that of the proprietor, was not Buddhist. So I think she anticipated that if the Mahabodhi society's founder was actually asked to provide Buddhist chowkidars, this would become, the first step towards making a claim for Sanchi as well. So this is one reason. But I think the Begum was also incensed because, Marshall's suggestion seemed to make it out that she was actually not capable of looking after the monuments in her own state. As she put it, she said his action was calculated to cast on her administration a slur which was not deserved. Now, Marshall, on the other hand, misunderstood her opposition to the appointment of Buddhist watchmen. And he understood it as being related to her personal religion. He said, well, this must be thought of as something which is heathen, and therefore she is disinclined to preserve Sanchi. And we, that is the imperial government, should therefore relieve her of Sanchi and actually take over the custody of the monument. Now, to cut a long story short, the endeavor here, as in the case of the Buddhist caretakers, wanting to bring them in, was really to exclude the local princely family from a monument in its own principality because of their own personal religion. Now, fortunately, this didn't happen, but this is the reason why Marshall's interaction with the Begum of Bhopal began on a sour note. Yet, many years later, the relationship was to take an entirely different and altogether more cordial turn. And this I find very interesting because, often we, when we talk about our colonial past, we paint the British in one particular way. But the example of Sanchi actually shows you that a relationship which began badly actually became much better over time. So, there is an element of pragmatism and things do change. Now, this happened many years later in the summer of 1912, when the Begum of Bhopal let it be known that she was actually interested in books on Sanchi. Now, I'm very curious as to why 1912, Apparently, she had hosted a lot of people at Sanchi. She had hosted viceroys there. She had hosted military commanders, other princely rulers. Even her son, Hamidullah Khan, when he married and his, bride was brought, they were actually first brought to Sanchi. But if you look at, her own chronology of, interaction with the monument, it's actually November 1911, which is very crucial. That is the time when there's an outbreak of plague in Bhopal, and she's just back from the European continent. So she has to actually stay at Sanchi, for several weeks before she can go to Bhopal. So I think that must have made her feel that, well, maybe I should do something for these monuments, which are so important as far as the princely state is concerned. Now, when Marshall heard about this and the fact that she was trying to get publications on Sanchi, he offered all the volumes that he had to her. And he also let it be known to her that, all of these were outdated, and it was necessary to get a complete monograph done on Sanchi. So he felt that there should be a monograph which was worthy of this particular set of monuments, and a monograph which was financed by the Bhopal Darbar. So to Marshall's delight and surprise, the Begum responded very generously and enthusiastically. Since authoring such a monograph meant that Marshall would have to camp there, she offered him all the necessary support. This included reserving a bungalow for his wife and his children. You can see his daughter here before one of the Sanchi gates. She arranged cows for the camp. The camp was, of course, conducted in right royal style, as you can see here. She paid a very large honorarium to Alfred Fouché, a French scholar and an acknowledged authority on Buddhist iconography, who is actually, one of the co-authors of Marshall for those volumes. And she also provided all the coolie labor that was required for the actual work. Now, at Sanchi, although John Marshall had thought that his work would be very simple, which is that he would survey the monument and prepare a monograph, once he started, working on the monuments, he realized that they actually needed to be extensively repaired. And while that, repair happened, a lot also got excavated. So the work was actually spread over several years, from 1912 till 1919. And the repairs included, dismantling stupas like this. This is stupa 3, and you can see here that the railing is being put back. It included setting the pillars of what is called Temple 18, a temple which actually goes back to the time of Emperor Ashoka. It has 3rd century BC foundations. So, the various wonderful exposed and conserved monuments that you see there really are the result of Marshall's very massive program, which was finally completed in 1919. And ironically, the very persons who he had viewed with such great suspicion played a very crucial role in Sanchi's restoration. The cost of this work, as I said, the construction of the Sanchi Museum, the publication of the Sanchi volumes, that is the Monuments of Sanchi. This was entirely financed by the Bhopal Darbar. And most strikingly, in sharp contrast to what Marshall had to say about the unreliability of Muslims, it was a Muslim assistant, Munshi Ghulam Qadir, who actually happened to be his right-hand man there. And if you look at the preface to the Sanchi volumes, Marshall actually dedicates a whole paragraph to the contribution of Ghulam Qadir, which is very unusual because he was just an excavation assistant. And ironically enough, it is the same Ghulam Qadir who is then given the responsibility for excavating another Buddhist monument, the famous Dharmarajika Stupa at Taxila. Now, of course, the story of Sanchi and the Darbar does not end with the completion of Marshall's restoration program. There's just one other element which is relevant from the perspective of Buddhist revival, and I want to mention it very quickly here. This concerns the return of what were believed to be Sanchi's relics and relic caskets. Now, as I mentioned to you, Cunningham had excavated the stupas. He had taken out the relics and the caskets, and these were then taken away to England, to two London museums, one the British Museum, and the second the Victoria and Albert Museum. Now, once Marshall finished the conservation of Sanchi in 1919, the Bhopal Darbar made a very serious move to get the relics back from, England. Now, today there's a very large debate about the movement of cultural treasure and the necessity of, the return of cultural treasure in situations where this has not been acquired legitimately. And I think there's also a legal framework, and in fact, some countries have managed to get certain objects back. But such cases were actually relatively rare in the early part of the 20th century, when the demand for Sanchi's relics was first made by the Bhopal Darbar. They first discussed this possibility of bringing back the relics with John Marshall. And interestingly enough, Marshall's opinion was that while Sanchi was the rightful and the appropriate place where these relics should be kept, as a matter of fact, he thought it was very unlikely that either of these two museums would actually, they could be prevailed upon to return them. So, after a lot of letters were exchanged, this matter of repatriating the objects was at that point in time dropped. But it was to resurface once again after a lapse of several years in 1939. And this time, eventually, it would lead to the transfer of what were believed to be the Sanchi relics to Sanchi, that is from England to Sanchi. Now, in this second initiative, initially it was the Buddhist societies, which took the, a very proactive approach. In a resolution which was passed at a meeting in Bombay of the Buddha Society in 1939, a request was made that these should be handed over to the Mahabodhi Society. And the Mahabodhi Society first said that it would place them in Calcutta, and then later said that no, we will construct a special vihara for the Sanchi relics in Delhi. Now, this demand was very much in line with what was happening vis-a-vis Buddhist relics in India. By 1939, interestingly enough, the museum had agreed to return the relics. But, the Second World War had broken out, and it was not thought safe to bring the relics back at that point in time. But at the point when the museum actually decided to return the relics, this was widely reported in Indian newspapers. And a report in The Statesman was read by the political member of the Bhopal Darbar, a man called Ali Akbar Haidari. And he, read this, and he immediately wrote to the, political agent of the British Raj in Sanchi, in Bhopal, and he said that, look, we had asked for the relics, and, Marshall had agreed, and he sent Marshall's letters, the old letters of 1990. They had agreed at that point that Sanchi was the rightful place if these actually had to come back. And so if the objects were now being repatriated, they should come back to where they originally were. Now, a protracted wrangle ensued after this. The British government actually supported the Bhopal Darbar and also felt that the relics should be brought back to Sanchi. And interestingly enough, the Archaeological Survey of India, its Director General, K.N. Dikshit, argued that no, as he put it, he says the right of the community which holds them sacred is more important than the original place. So he was actually quite happy with, the Mahabodhi Society taking custody of those relics. So the Bhopal government then negotiated with the Mahabodhi Society. the Mahabodhi Society eventually agreed, and when the relics were finally sent back in 1947, that's when the journey began. It was a long journey through Myanmar and Nepal and Sri Lanka and so on. You know, it was really one of those state occasions. Eventually, those were brought back to Sanchi. The Bhopal Darbar gave the land for constructing a vihara there for these relics, and it also gave several thousand rupees for the construction of the building there. Now, you know, such ceremonies, you know, and such important early relics of the Buddha's foremost disciples, that is Mahamoggallana and Sariputta, you know, when these were actually brought back, it became very much an occasion for earning diplomatic brownie points. So, you know, it was Prime Minister Nehru who actually came to Sanchi in 1952, and that was the slide I began with. And it was amidst the chanting of, you know, hymns by bhikshus from many Buddhist countries in Asia that he handed over these relics for re-enshrinement. You can see, you know, Pandit Nehru here, but you can also see the Burmese Premier, UNO, and, you know, there were dignitaries from many other countries as well. You know, here you can see many of these dignitaries on the steps of, you know, the new vihara where the relic caskets, you know, were brought back. Nehru spoke on this occasion. Nehru, you can see here making a speech, and there's also, you know, UNO. And he spoke at length about the fear and hatred in the contemporary world, and how actually by remembering the Buddha and his teachings, maybe a better world order would, you know, emerge. And I think this was important in the light of, you know, the Second World War and the horrific Holocaust, you know, that had preceded and accompanied it. But, you know, considering that, you know, 1952 is also a time when there should have been some self-reflection on the communal frenzy that marked the aftermath of independence and partition in India, I think it's very strange that Prime Minister Nehru's speech made no mention at all of the fact that it was a Muslim darbar which actually had, you know, restored Buddhist Sanchi. I mean, I always feel looking back that maybe, you know, Nehru today would have scripted his speech differently. He wouldn't have just used it as an occasion to strengthen ties with other Asian nations. And he could have actually, or he may have used it as, you know, an occasion for showcasing the quality of Indian secularism by giving due credit to the Muslim rulers for the return both of the relics and to the Begum of Bhopal for the conservation of Buddhist monuments. But there's a final twist that I want to mention. Now, apparently the relics of Sariputta and Mahamoggallana, which were brought back and enshrined, the relic caskets were certainly enshrined on the Sanchi hill. They are certainly those of the Buddha's foremost disciples, but these are the ones that had actually been removed from a neighboring Buddhist complex called Satdhara. These are the caskets, interior of one casket with the inscription, and in the interior of the second casket with the inscription. Now, if you go back to the Cunningham volumes and you look at the Sanchi relic caskets, this is what they look like. And, you know, the shape is actually, especially the lid, is completely different from what was enshrined at Sanchi. So the Sanchi relic caskets of the two disciples are still, you know, untraceable. So it was thought that, well, these are the Sanchi caskets, but they were not. But of course, notwithstanding this final twist, I think at a purely personal level, for me, the modern history of ancient Sanchi is very important for two reasons. First, the Bhopal Darbar's role in the conservation and in the restitution of the relics reveals the manner in which Indians contributed to the maintenance of historic structures. I mean, if you look at, the major writings of the colonial era, it seems as if it was the British who conserved everything, but this wasn't the case. Here, of course, we are talking about a princely state, but there were also a lot of very ordinary Indians who used to contribute in places like Kashmir, in Gujarat, in South India, towards the conservation, of our heritage. And that's why it has survived. So I think, a much more rounded history of conservation still remains to be written. And of course, secondly, the story about, a famous Buddhist site where a central character is a woman ruler. And, that's what makes it so important, because women rulers, especially those, who are concerned with the upkeep of Buddhist monuments, are not a particularly common phenomenon in modern India. And I think the fact that Sultan Jahan Begum does not appear in the familiar form of a victim, but she's very much, an agent, and she's refusing to be intimidated by British notions of how she should act. And she refuses to let her personality and her persona be squeezed into the crude religious paradigm, that John Marshall was talking about. I think, eventually this did demonstrate to the British Raj that, personal faith, whether it was that of the humble chowkidars or caretakers, or, of the ruling house, was actually quite irrelevant to the question of providing support to, the Buddhist heritage of that particular princely state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nayanjot, for that talk and for all the visuals, and thanks for,
I know.
inspiring us.
But I realized that I'm exhausted, so I was just sort of, hoping that there was some coherence to what I said.
No, it was. It's interesting because just yesterday, when MJ Akbar, who many of you heard speak, we were talking about the Bamiyan Buddha and the Taliban's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha. And he was saying that, again, the view of that destruction is too simplistic because Iran actually sent a mission to plead that the Bamiyan Buddha would not be destroyed. So again, when you look at, the different heritage sites, the different monuments, this has now given me another level of complexity to work with. So thank you for that. And I'd really like to, if anyone has questions, over to you.
Can I just quickly respond? Actually, Sanchi is in the middle of a cluster of Buddhist monuments. There is Satthara, there are various other ones at places like Andher and so on and so forth. So that's just one complex. There are a number of Buddhist monuments very early in Karnataka. One of the most famous is Kanganahalli, where the earliest labeled sculpture of Ashoka has been found. It has a label which says Raja Asoko. So what happens, I think, in Buddhist tourist pilgrimage is that you take that circuit, which forms a pattern in North India, and you actually don't, go across the Vindhyas and into Madhya Pradesh and beyond that as well into, Karnataka and Andhra. You have just fabulous, sites there. Now, on the question of the Buddhist presence in India, actually it's a very strong Buddhist presence. And I mean, if you look at the neo-Buddhists, you see, this then gets us back to the question of what is a Buddhist. There are many types of Buddhists. And if you look at the neo-Buddhists, the Dalits, who converted to Buddhism, they don't actually believe in the concept of, of monkhood and nuns and so on and so forth. So it's a completely different kind of Buddhism. But interestingly enough, these various Buddhisms intersect at places of pilgrimage. So for example, at places like Amaravati, for example, you will have Dalit Buddhists coming and you will have Tibetan Buddhists coming and others. But the presence is not as minor because you're really looking at, many lakhs of people who are, Buddhists. But they're not the kinds of Buddhists that, one may have as far as one's imagination goes. So there's variety, there's diversity there. Sorry, yeah. Well, if you look at Sri Lankan Buddhists, and if you look at Sinhala nationalism, there's a very strong sense there that Buddhists can be soldiers. So, it's sort of ultra-nationalist in a sense. So I don't see any kind of dichotomy, in that context. And they will cite, chapter and verse to you. I was at a conference where there was this young scholar called Anuruddha Pradeep from Sri Lanka, who actually presented, the evidence, what he thought was the evidence from the text, to be, a soldier and to fight for a just cause. So Sinhala nationalism is a very good example of, someone who, of people who are soldiers and who also, imagine themselves, as Buddhists. Now, as far as, my talk was really on the modern history of ancient Buddhism. But if you look at the sculpture and so on and so forth, there's just a variety of symbols, especially in the ancient, sites. So on the one hand, you would have depictions of a variety of Buddhist Jatak scenes, stories from the life of the Buddha or the former lives, the Bodhisattvas and so on and so forth. And many of, those eventually, the purpose is to argue that, look, violence, you must move away from violence towards peace and so on and so forth. But otherwise, apart from that, even something as simple as the, Dhamma Chakra, that's a very, very potent symbol of Buddhism. But, I actually don't lay much emphasis on symbols because it's there in the, you look at it on the Indian flag. And then if you think about, government policy towards Naxals and, a whole lot of areas, including Kashmir, there really is nothing, there which lives up to the ideals of, the ancient Dhamma Chakra, which is there, on our national flag. Actually, Ajanta is much later. Sanchi, owes its origin from whatever has been excavated to Emperor Ashoka, which is really the 3rd century before the Christian era. And although its history is much longer, but if you look at Ajanta, Ajanta really, the beauty of Ajanta is really from the Gupta period onwards. You don't have anything at Ajanta which goes back to the late, centuries BC. And the fact that Sanchi actually continues till, the 12th century after the Christian era shows us that our whole notion of Buddhist decline needs to be rethought. There were many monuments, of the type of Sanchi, which were living shrines where monks, large communities of monks lived. And, some of them go to the 12th century, others to the 13th and 14th centuries. So, the idea that, all this declined in one go because of Muslim conquest and all, it really didn't happen like that. Some destruction did happen, but Buddhism didn't disappear. the relic boxes that were brought back are there in the vihara, which is next to, the Sanchi monument. So it's very close. So, before you actually enter Sanchi, you can see that. I mean, they're only opened out on particular days and so on, but they're there. As far as the reliquaries go, the bits of bone, beads, a little gold, and so on, they were actually redistributed. Some of it went to Sri Lanka, and maybe, I'm not sure, but I think part of it may have gone to Myanmar as well. Yeah. So the policy was that you kept the relic boxes, but as far as, the actual reliquaries go, those were redistributed. And that happened to a lot of the relics that were found in India. Some were sent to Thailand, and others were re-enshrined in India, for instance, at the Calcutta Vihara and so on. But they were taken out of their original contexts, which, I think it was wrong. I think they should have been brought back to Sanchi. Yes, that is what, Buddhists maintain. And I think there is a point of view, there as well. But, in a sense, if you already have relics, to just accumulate more relics, is very un-Buddhist, So, from the religious point of view, from that perspective alone, it's wrong. Even at the point in time when it used to be mentioned that Buddhism had completely disappeared from India, it's, if you look at the 19th century, for instance, the late 19th century, there are reasonable sized Buddhist communities in Himachal Pradesh, for example, also in Chittagong, in Darjeeling. So it's not as if in Orissa. But, the sense always is that they follow many, non-Buddhist practices. So the idea about what is, a true Buddhist came to be defined in terms of an ancient canon, which was not necessarily followed even in ancient times. To think that because we have texts today, we follow those texts. You have so many laws, but do we actually obey all the laws? We don't. So to think that that canonical Buddhism really existed, and then to use that as the measure of all things in the modern world, I think, it doesn't really work well. So the idea that the Buddhists actually of Orissa used to go and, put the funerary remains, the ashes of, the elders who had died at Gaya, which is a completely Hindu practice. There are people who are, writing in their books that, this is just really awful. How could Buddhists be doing this? But, why not? Real life is about, untidy practices. Yeah. To distribute them, but then to keep distributing them to the places that already had got their quotas, from the other sites. The state used to decide. So the British government actually used it as a tool of diplomacy. So you have all these ceremonies, and it's really funny, the relics are coming from Shahji Dheri in Peshawar. And this particular archaeological superintendent, D.B. Spooner, he's carrying them strapped to his body. And he says, yeah, because it's just so precious. And then, he comes to Calcutta and he's just received with so much pomp, including a large number of soldiers are standing there, to receive the relics, of the Buddha, which, is just so ironical. And there's great pomp and, so you showed that, well, you were just so generous about these things. Thank you very much.